This session is McCurdy. Charlotte McCurdy is an award-winning designer and researcher who works at the intersection of emerging technology, futures, and existential threats. In her research, she develops carbon-negative artifacts and systems using design-led experimentation. As a design strategist, she advises across sectors on strategic foresight, decarbonization, and communication. Her work has been shown around the world, including at the London Design Museum and in the Cooper Hewitt Triennial. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, CNN, Dezeen, Wallpaper, and Vogue, and has been supported by the MacArthur Foundation, Swarovski, and Science Sandbox. Recent collaborations include Hyundai Genesis 3.1 Philip Lim in the UN Office of Partnerships. Previously, she served as assistant professor of industrial design and senior global future scientist at Arizona State University, as well as assistant professor of industrial design at the Rhode Island School of Design. She's currently core design lecturer at Hassel-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford University. So Charlotte McCurdy, the floor is now yours. Go ahead and present.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Here, I'm going to pop up my share, get that going as quickly as we can. Let me try to get this out of, it's not going to let me see the chat, I don't think. So it's not going to let me see the chat in this moment, but it's disappointing. Okay, what I'd love, quick warm up, shake it up. I know this is the fourth session. Good morning from San Francisco, but I know some of you are on the East Coast and have been thinking and working for a long time. I'd love if in the chat, briefly, quickly, dropping in your name, just your first name, whatever, where you're dialing in from, and 3 words or phrases that kind of triangulate your interests and passion in climate, impact, and the future. And these can be surprising words even. I'm going to change the view so that I can see what's in the chat, hopefully. Oh, can I see what's in the chat? Why can't I see the chat? There, chat. All right. Starting to trickle in. Emotional response, motivated, excited, hopeful. Okay, feel free to keep those coming in. I know that we have a whole group here of people doing awesome stuff. And I'll get started in the background with sharing a little bit about my work. There, now I can see the chat on top of my presentation. Okay, so what I was thinking I would do today is talk a little bit about my work, looking at the other amazing presenters. I feel like I have a specific angle coming from design, coming from materials. So I thought I'd share a little bit of that perspective because you're getting so much input from these amazing different spaces. So I thought I'd start with concretion, use that to abstract out to maybe some generalizable concepts that you can take to your other projects, and then land back on a concretion, if that sounds okay. So as was mentioned, I'm Charlotte McCurdy. I am a designer and a design educator. Most recently just moved to San Francisco, just getting settled in here at Stanford, and very happy to be here. Design might be broader than you think it is as a practice. It's not just making beautiful things, the design of systems, of collaboration, designing strategies, designing, it's maybe hold that in your mind as you see what I'm going to share with you today. Clicky. Okay, so one thing that design can be driven by is curiosity and inspiration in that intersection. And what does bringing that mindset to the challenge of climate change look like and allow? Here's our first concretion. I'm best known for my work around this plastic that I developed, an alternative to synthetic hydrocarbon plastic. It's made of marine macroalgae, and it's a proof of concept for what a carbon negative material culture could be. If you look around yourself right now, you would probably be stunned by how much is petrochemical, is fossil fuel in origin, right? So like obviously anything plastic you see at your desk, but also probably the paint on your walls, anything that has adhesive in it. Look at what you're wearing. Half of textiles right now are petrochemical in origin. Skincare products you're putting directly on your skin. 98% of our pharmaceuticals are petrochemical feedstocks to get to those very clean, amazing molecules that do so much for health. dye. Most dye these days is synthetic. So there's so much of our material culture that is intertwined with fossil fuel. And if we are going to decarbonize, it's way more and it's way deeper into our day-to-day lives than just light and energy for fuel. So that's part of what I was digging into and thinking about in terms of what would a decarbonized future look and feel like with this. But how did this and then so this is a proof of concept. I wanted to make a tool for talking about climate change, make something tangible and tractable that would be accessible and exciting for talking about climate change. And lots of people seem to think it was an interesting tool for talking about climate change. So I've been able to use it to reach and think to broad audiences. It's been really, if there's validation that it was a tool for talking, I feel like I can point to its record. That project then led to making a dress with Philip Lim. That then led to working with Genesis on one of their communications around one of their electric vehicles. So it's been this crazy ride. How did that happen? I'm not a fashion designer. I didn't set out to think about plastics. I started with a core passion and interest about climate change, but I'm sure for everyone in this room, especially if the younger people who are in high school, I know that's our conveners are incredible, ambitious people. This can feel huge. It can feel very disempowering. It can feel very far away to try to take on climate change. And often that's connected to the way we visualize it, right? A lot of the visual metaphors we use for climate change are literally from space, long range, distant, Arctic. And so in terms of trying to bring the salience of climate change closer into the present tense human scale, that was a core interest of mine. But looking at our current emissions, so we're drilling down, we're thinking about climate change and trying to find a way to access it, to get some leverage, to bring a design lens, to bring in a creative and inspired based lens to climate change. I started asking questions to be conveyed in ways that not just taking the sort of the common stock phrases or like I'm sure you've started to hear these like repeated sound bites and digging into like, well, where does that come from? What is that really relative to? Where are the sources on that? So one of the questions I was interested in was, so here we have total global emissions broken up by different ways of slicing them. So on the left, we have the like core source. In the middle, we have by industry, and on that far right, we have by greenhouse gas type. You've probably heard that like methane is a worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and these like HFCs, these forever chemicals, are even worse. There is a standardized way, CO2 equivalents, for trying to compare and hold these different molecules together. The bulk of our emissions still is CO2. So this left-hand band, going into this conversation, thinking about how we are conventionally framing climate change, there's a lot of emphasis on burning fuels for energy and transport. And that makes sense. It's 2/3 of this left-hand column, right? But I got really interested in this last third, direct emissions. What's that about? You see the biggest chunk of that is agricultural forestry and land use change. Whenever we burn down rainforests to expand generally meat production, the carbon, the embodied carbon of that forest goes up in the air, right? So where's the carbon? Where's it staying? How's it flowing? I got really interested in this squiggle. You're not gonna be able to see my mouse, but that goes, the top big ribbon that goes from direct emissions to industry. This is called industrial process emissions. It's the emissions caused by the core chemistry of making materials, right? So not the energy used to advance the process, not the heat applied to the core chemistry of transforming some fossil carbon of various kinds into the stuff we use in industry. So we just saw a great timeline on atmospheric CO2 concentration. This is an even bigger scale. This is hundreds of millions of years. So this is like Massive, massive, massive. And the main point I want to make here is that like we are in this, like you see where hominids are, like we are only evolved for this tiny little narrow band. But if we start to zoom back out, there's this period I want to highlight of the Carboniferous period, which is where 90% of our coal forms, because this is a moment in where evolution and geology overlap in a really fascinating way. This is a moment where plants develop the ability to produce lignin, which is an incredible structural biopolymer that lets plants to go up, right? It had been a landscape of sort of fern-like plants on terrestrial soils, and suddenly we have trees for the first time. But nothing could break down lignin. Bacteria and fungi hadn't evolved a way to eat it yet, so trees grew, fell over, and didn't rot. And the literal physical mass of those trees becomes our coal, right? Maybe sounds familiar. A molecule that nothing else could break down. It took 100 million years for bacteria and fungi to evolve to be able to metabolize lignin. We probably don't want to wait 100 million years for bacteria to eat our plastics. It is like energy dense organic molecule. Like it is fuel. If you burn it, it releases heat. If something could eat it, it would get energy from it. But we're not the first form of life to change the climate. You see this major drop in CO2 concentration that coincides with this. That process of trees growing, capturing carbon, also changing the soil structure because of the way their roots were, massive drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere into solids, into in part our coals. So this idea we have about synthetic and organic, when you start to zoom out on huge timescales, they become less binary categories, right? Our synthetic materials that we're making from fossil fuels, those fossil fuels are biotic in origin. They are connected to metabolic pathways of life. And so this is all sort of getting me, I'm starting to go down this funnel from just climate in general to maybe there's an opportunity in embodied carbon, this relationship between the gaseous carbon that we are justifiably like terrified of, right? It has solid forms. How do we start to think about those solid forms? So then I asked the question, where is the carbon? Like really, where is it at any given time? Because we are freaked out by the marginal changes in the atmosphere's carbon. So if we were going to represent an atmosphere's worth of carbon as a single C, that's 720 gigatons of carbon. Great example of how scientific communication doesn't actually meet people where they are. Gigaton, also billion ton, slightly more common way of articulating it. Okay. This is my most depressing slide, by the way, just to prepare you. 1 atmosphere's worth of carbon. Let's put that in context. There's 3 times as much carbon bound up in terrestrial plants and soils, right? Deforestation, bad for biodiversity, absolutely. Also, the land use change we talked about before, that carbon goes somewhere, right? And it generally is going to go into the air. The ocean, 6 times as much carbon in the ocean. The ocean has been a huge buffer for our CO2 emissions, but half of the carbon we've released has been taken into the ocean. Part of why it's acidifying, that CO2 becomes carbonic acid in the water. That's not great, but it's protected us from a lot of the atmospheric concentration rising even higher. There's a lot more carbon in known proven fossil fuel reserves. This is not about running out of oil. We cannot afford to use the oil we have, right? Because if we take all of that carbon and shove it up into the atmosphere, can you imagine, right? But we still have to zoom out because carrageenans are the chemical precursors to fossil fuels. They've not gone through quite as much of a process of heat and pressure and time, but there's energy there and there's carbon there. And we figured out how to make fracking economically viable. We are innovative as a species. We'll figure out a way to burn this if we can. But then there's still more. There's sedimentary carbonates. Every time we make cement, we're tapping into this supply. Sedimentary carbonates are also connected to biological systems. marine invertebrates over hundreds of millions of years, the shells, the skeletons, that calcium carbon, that's precipitating down, collecting, becoming rock, and capturing carbon in the process. But that's not all of it. There's actually even more. Okay, so like this is an example and of science communication, right? Because normally this data is presented logarithmically, because this is a bonkers visualization, right? But we don't think logarithmically. It's not, we barely think in percentages actually when you like study people. So again, I'm investigating how to make climate change like perceivable, more directly, like talking to like the brainstem, lizard brain of us to see what that could unlock. So I'm starting to narrow down on some materials. Within materials, some of the major materials that are complicit in climate change, that are intrinsically connected to greenhouse gas emissions right now, are cement, steel, and plastic. Cement, for the reasons we just talked about. You take CaCO3 out of the ground, you heat it up so that it'll become its more active form. CaCO3, you literally crack off a CO2 for every base calcium carbonate to make it that active form that then you can add water to and get that cementing property. There's a lot of innovation happening in cement space. Pretty interesting. Steel, difference between iron and steel, you add a little bit of carbon, and right now that carbon's coming from coal mostly. Plastics, this image on the right is farmland where entire rows are being covered with plastic. And unfortunately, when if you're engaged in organic farming and you've given yourself a rule against using synthetic pesticides, one easy way to manage pests is to cover everything with plastic and then only burn out holes for your crops, right? So there's massive amounts of plastic. It's not just water bottles, right? So I'm thinking about the materiality of these fossil fuels, and they're often so invisible, right? Like probably the closest you and I get to actually interacting with like core fossil fuels would be if we were to fill a car with gasoline. And even then we're not touching it. We're like maybe smelling it. It's this invisible sort of blood. So like, what is this stuff? Like what does it mean to interact with it? Fractional distillation is the process by which we separate crude oil out by its molecule length. And this is an important thing to understand, to realize that plastics are a fundamental co-product of fossil fuels, right? It's not one without the other. So what we take this heterogeneous mix of carbon molecules of different sizes, we separate them out by size, and the super short ones, C1, C4, 1 carbon length, 4 carbon length, those are gases at room temperature, super valuable. You can burn them for energy. We start to go down, you see our C7 to C12 car fuel. You ever heard of the octane rating of a fuel? Octo 8C8. It talks about the proportion of 8 carbon long molecules. And then we get all the way down to these long, heavy, solid waxes, asphalt, much less valuable as molecules. But we take them to the next tower in our refinery, which is a catalytic cracker, and we break off 2C length molecules, which is that feedstock for the entire petrochemical industry, that ethylene, right? So these fuels and plastics are absolutely interconnected. One distinction I want to be sure to form in your mind, I'm sure you've heard a lot about biodegradable plastics, compostable plastics. I'm talking about a separate axis than biodegradability, right? The difference between something being bio-based and petrochemical origin and whether it's biodegradable or non-biodegradable at the end of its life, the two separate factors. So most of our life, we're right now in this bottom left quadrant with a circle where most of our plastics are petrochemical origin and non-biodegradable. And hopefully, probably, we want to get to this top right quadrant where things are bio-based and biodegradable. But you can have, and there's tons of research going into making better petrochemical in origin biodegradable plastics, which is to say, biodegradable, it's being metabolized by microorganisms. That's a one-way funnel from that carbon into the atmosphere, right? While it's plastic, it's holding the carbon in kind of a perverse way. The literal chemical carbon of its molecules. There's also definitely possible to make bio-based non-biodegradable or very difficult to biodegrade plastics. We can make, if you've ever gotten like a Dasani bottle with a little plant bottle logo on it, that's polyester, that's PET, exact technical PET that's been made entirely of plant sugars, right? We have the chemistry to take plant sugars and turn them into these drop-in immortal plastics. So we're starting to drill down on material futures. We have this status quo where a lot of our materials are being made of these fossil fuels, which are biologic in deep origin, as we've discussed. So sunlight hit the surface of the earth, photosynthesizing life built their bodies, which in doing so, they were trapping carbon into the molecules of their life. Organic chemistry or an organic molecule is defined by having a carbon backbone of some kind. Some of that biomass settled and collected, went through just the right process of heat, pressure, and trapping to then have these reservoirs that we pull out of the ground. We separate by length, we transform, and we make stuff out of. Then that stuff maybe gets burned, and that CO2 also releases. But these molecules represent stored energy of the ancient sun. So this is where this metaphor that I started to use of these things being made of ancient sunlight started to take form, which then leads to the question of what would it look like to make things out of present tense sunlight? Could we have algae and also, sorry, petroleum? It's mostly algae. It's not dinosaur bones. I'm sorry. What would it look like to have algae that's photosynthesizing today, that's capturing carbon dioxide today, be the feedstock with which we make stuff? And this is this really tricky, non-intuitive relationship between gas, energy, and matter. We are limited primates. This is one core principle of design, is to try to meet people where they're at and design for our own limitations, right? Like, we will never be perfectly rational actors. Like, just education is not enough to change behavior. That's been demonstrated over and over and over again. So if I asked you the question, and you can test this on your friends who didn't sit in on this talk, when a squirrel buries an acorn and a huge tree grows, where does the mass of that tree come from? The gut intuitive reaction is most often, like, from the ground. The stuff became stuff. The vast majority of that mass of the tree came from the air, right? It came from CO2 that was trapped through photosynthesis. That's why when you burn wood and burn it really thoroughly, you're left with just these trace minerals, which it did get from the ground and needed to grow. But there's this alchemy happening between gas and solid that we're not that great at holding on to. Photosynthesis is this process of taking gas, that CO2, water, and making these incredible molecules that are super useful to life and to us. So I'm starting to circle in on this question: what would it feel like? Could I create something that would give the feeling of a decarbonized world, of being back in a present tense relationship with the sun, where we're not engaging with this ancient trapped sunlight through these fossil fuels? Like, before the Industrial Revolution, we met our needs for food and fuel, shelter, clothing with the energy of the sun and its secondary products. So, like, wind is secondary energy from the sun, right? The sun unevenly heats the surface of the earth. That pressure differential causes wind. Water, hydropower, secondary to the sun. Evaporation off of big water masses creates clouds, creates rain, creates water falling downhill. So the sun is like this deep root of almost all of our power. Not nuclear, not tidal, not geothermal, but pretty much everything else is energy, is kinetic energy or stored chemical potential energy that's coming from the sun. So what would it look like to get back into a present tense relationship with the sun and not going backwards to pre-industrial technology? Right, we have 8 billion people we're accountable to. Like, how do we hold that as a core principle? So I started to narrow in on plastic. I narrowed it on algae because it is one of the most efficient organisms at converting solar energy into useful molecules. I started focusing on marine macroalgae because a lot of the microalgae work, you're constrained by, if you need to grow it on land, what are you displacing on land? If you're just trading farming for farming algae, are you actually net sequestering more carbon than what that like arable land would have been doing otherwise? And a lot of microalgae is freshwater, and we are limited on our supplies of potable freshwater anyway. So marine macroalgae started to become the goal. And there was an important shift that had to happen between a framework of sustainability towards a framework of regenerativity, right? So sustainability, maintaining the system we have, trying to keep it afloat. We are at a point where there's already too much CO2 in the atmosphere. If we stopped emitting tomorrow, we would still be on our way to increase negative effects. Last I checked, like more than 90% of the IPCC scenarios for staying under 1.5 degrees centigrade rely on carbon removal technology that is not yet at scale. It doesn't yet have a like business model. So we need so carbon removal can be this tricky thing because sometimes it can be positioned as like an excuse or a band-aid on continued fossil fuel extraction and burning. But from a systems level, we need to both stop extracting new fossil fuel and get carbon removal up and running. Like that's very clearly modeled by the IPCC. So to be regenerative, to be not just doing no harm, but actively repairing, actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere, that became an important criteria. So as we think about where photosynthesis is, how do we hold ourselves accountable to that 8 billion people? How do we do more with the sun we already have than we could before the Industrial Revolution? There's two things that give me hope. One is that solar panels are incredible, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, our most efficient technology for converting sunlight into useful molecules was like C4 corns, right? 2% efficient at photosynthesis. Off the shelf conventional solar panels are 15% efficient right now. There's experimental ones in the lab that are pushing 50% efficient. We can do more with the sunlight we already have. And if we think carefully about how to make use of photosynthesis, we can also be increasing biomass, not decreasing it very urgently, and not just swapping one thing for the other. So you might have heard there was sort of a scandal around palm oil, which was trying to bill itself as being carbon neutral at a certain point. But if you zoomed out the broader scope of the rainforests that were removed in order to increase these palm oil plantations, then they were absolutely net emitters, right? So what are we trading? It's not enough that something is bio-based per se, right? What's the whole system that led to that material getting into your hand? Just because it is the thing it says it is, doesn't necessarily make it beneficial. And this is like so hard and becomes about traceability super quickly. So I'm a designer. In these spaces, I got much more focused on changing how can I move the needle on political will and collective imagination. In a lot of these cases, the technological capability is there, and even increasingly, the financial practicality is there. There's still tons of work to do on the technology side. There's still tons of work on actually implementing and rolling these things out. But so often, I found that the biggest barriers were from the demand side and from a lack of shared vision of what we could build. And that's where I think a designer can really show up. And just a little bit of context on that. In design, there's fields where we intersect with futures. We're also intersecting with like norms and how they evolve. But just to focus on this last one, technology adaptation, there's a lot of tech that works, that's cool, and it never gets commercialized because there are these valleys of death around tech transfer that have to do with investment and patience. The way we support things right now is not long-term thinking. So in terms of thinking about political will, in terms of thinking about the kind of support that this kind of transformation will need, focusing in on making charismatic objects that try to draw people in, that they're inviting, became a clear goal. Tons of parallel experiments, smashing together different approaches, new tech, ancient tech, to try to get to something that would let me create an object that would tell the story, let me start to have these conversations about embodied carbon and what kind of material future we could build, led me here. And I don't introduce this as like a technology per se, but really as a tool for talking and debating and trying to create that shared vision for a future, and to try to articulate that our goals can be more ambitious than just minimizing harm, that we can really start to be thinking about like net benefit. So my takeaways for you, and this is maybe focused on the younger people in the audience, is I really want to encourage you to ask why, and just keep asking why, and ask for information to be conveyed and structured in a way that really feels meaningful to you. And if you get to a point where no one can answer that why anymore, you just found your research field. You just found where you can contribute to the discourse, right? But don't be shy to do that. One thing that's great about being a designer is that no one expects you to be an expert in things. So you don't have to pretend like you already know everything. You get to ask the dumb question over and over and over again. And then, like, well, that's still not quite, that's not really the answer to the question I asked, is it? That's a slightly different, that's an answer you've already given to some other question. Another thing I want to articulate is that if you're passionate about climate change, you don't need to be strictly a scientist, right? Every industry is transforming, needs to transform. You can bring your passion about doing better on climate change, and your skills, the things you are already like good at, excited about, like you can bring that forward. You can do that work. So every industry needs to change. If you're not like a STEMmy person, that's not relevant to your ability to have an impact. We need really interdisciplinary teams. We need a lot of cooperation and collaboration to solve these wicked problems. Having you as an advocate wherever you end up is absolutely necessary. Another thing I hope that you take away from this is a sense of agency, right? Climate change can feel so massive and daunting, and like something that is not your fault as a young person, right? It's generations of emissions, generations of systems of emissions. But if you get trapped in a position of like complaining or frustration, you've already trapped yourself in a mindset where you don't have agency, where you can't be part of responsibility, which is to say, not that you're to blame responsible, you are able to respond able. So I hope you can find a sense of authorship over the future, that you are the subject of the sentence, not the object. And that mindset shift is super hard and is unfair. It can feel awful too, but it's way more psychologically sustainable than just feeling anxious and like the victim. So I hope you can find ways to embrace agency. And there's so much work happening. We can do this together. Another thing I want to highlight is that you're going to have to make paths. Like, this is new territory. This is not a clean professional sequence that's been laid out for you. Again, every industry needs change. You can go do the med school thing and do like, there are careers that have very clear paths laid out for you. But there's so much uncertainty and instability that even those really tried and true paths are getting reformed and changed. So it can feel super ambiguous. It's a lot of responsibility to both invent the path and do the work. But like, we're not going to solve this by doing the same old thing. And by being part of making the path, you're helping people follow you and come up the path behind you. So understand that that is real work. It has value. It can feel invisible, but don't be afraid to break paths. The last thing I want to offer is do it for the work, right? So there are going to be things that are like uncomfortable, or they don't feel like they're in your skill set. Like, I'm actually kind of introverted, but I'm here talking to you guys today for the work, right? That I really believe that I want to share this work. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience you guys have convened. But there will be moments where you have to lean into discomfort, lean into things that aren't in your comfort zone. But for me, like, just holding on to that mantra of like, I'm doing it for the work. Like, the work is worth doing this for. So there will be challenges for you personally, but you can go forward with it. What I'm focusing on right now is my brand new role at Stanford. Like, literally just moved this winter. This last week was the first week of the quarter. Just launched these two classes on the top, History and Ethics of Design and Design 1. Next year, I'll be launching a senior capstone that will be focused on climate and environment for our undergraduate majors, and also a advanced elective at the intersection of fashion and biomaterials. If you see any of these 4 classes, and you're like, oh my God, I need to collaborate, like, I've got a great guest lecturer you should have, or like, I have a friend in industry and they have a challenge that they really need a design or behavioral or human-centered like lens on, that maybe these groups of students can crack, please reach out. These are actively being developed, but this is my focus for the moment. So that's me. Here, take a screenshot of my email and my Instagram handle. Things are in flux. Some new stuff on the horizon. One cool thing happening in May I can't talk about yet, so watch this space. And I'll open up for questions. Also, for the young people in the room, part of why I include this timeline is that you don't need to know what you're doing yet, and life will take you strange places, and you'll do lots of different things, and that all is going to be part of the fascinating machine that is your brain that lets you do the work that only you can do. So don't feel freaked out like you have to have it all figured out once you graduate high school or graduate college. It's always, life is going to take you strange places. All right, I'm going to stop share and take a look at any questions or these awesome, wait, I want to read these feelings: anxious, angry, fearful, yeah, hopeful, inquisitive, nervous, worried, upset, scared, yeah, snow, economics, absolutely, mad, frustrated, numb, yeah, angry, excited, belief, there's like an interpersonal piece of that for sure. Okay, question: what created your inspiration to create fashion by using climate change? That was totally an accident. Like, I am not a fashion designer. I joke I made the mistake of having my first prototype be a raincoat because fashion has a huge sustainability problem. And so, like, I'm the help, Charlotte, let's do fashion now. I did know that I really specifically wanted to rewind. In the algae space, talking to lots of experts and people who had various experience, there was a big moment around freshwater microalgae in terms of creating alternative fuels that happened in the aughts. And there was a lot of energy investment, and then it sort of collapsed. And part of why that happened was that fuels are like gasoline tank kind of fuels are a commodity, And the business model for these algae fuels worked when the price of gasoline was super high, but the algae industry can't control the price of gasoline. So I had that in the back of my mind as like a warning from learning about the sort of track record of the intersection of the technological possibility and the economic feasibility of any given innovation to act, because to reach the market and actually scale, it can't just be we can do this, we can do it, and the math works out in the economic system that we're trying to launch it into, which is varies, right? Like Europe and America, even that difference, there's the kinds of policy support that exist in Europe still way outflanks what America is able to support in this space. So when I was first making these prototypes and I had these like little swatches of plastic that I was having conversations with people about, a big constant feedback was like, oh my God, Amazon bubble, you know, those little squishy pillows of air, you should make algae Amazon packing. And to me, it was like, no, not at all, because that's a commodity and I'll be competing on price with synthetic plastics, which are a co-product of fossil fuels and therefore artificially cheap, because the entire fossil fuel economic engine produces all of this excess plastic. So I knew I wanted to go to have it be a consumer facing, because B2B is tricky. This happens in cement. It's hard to introduce better climate beneficial cements because you're selling to contractors and developers who are very risk averse. They have building with these particular materials. They know how they perform over time. And you can show up with the greatest data sheet saying like, look, it's actually stronger, it's better compression performance, better, it heals itself. Like, and still people are like, I don't know, like little sounds a little spooky. Whereas consumer facing, my thought is that I could reach a segment of the population that is anxious, angry, like scared, passionate, and we're willing to spend a premium on something that expresses our values to a certain extent as consumers, whereas a B2B client, they're way more price sensitive. So then fashion made sense because that is a category where people really entangle their identity into what they wear, and they really project like the person they want to be seen as in the world through their clothing. I also made a raincoat because in terms of having this goal of having climate change feel real and personal and not in the future, but already here, I wanted something that was directly connected to the rise in extreme weather. So I'm originally from the East Coast. Hurricanes or more the way that shows up. Maybe now that I'm in San Francisco, I'll make like fire suits, but we'll see. But maybe that, wait, it's fashion, yeah. So, and then, so part of the model there is in terms of like tech transfer, something like this, like an iPhone started, and maybe this connects to some of the, no, it hasn't come up yet, but something like this could start as a real luxury product, very expensive, very few people in the market could acquire it, but because it created desire and demand, we got to the economies of scale where now 2/3 of the adult population on Earth have a smartphone of some kind, because those microprocessors have been leaned into for innovation, economies of scale have been reached, they've gotten so much cheaper over time. So that's also part of the mental model of like, how do you have these things actually be able to get over that valley of death and become normal, not just elite. That there's reason to believe that some of these things can start in the higher end of the market, and that helps them become normal and accessible financially to more and more people. All right, fashion. And then the partnership with Philip Lim, part of why I was excited about that is that in fashion, there's often there's a big, there's a well-supported angle that recycled polyester is an aspirational goal. And I disagree with that. So showing up with, again, can we have a more ambitious vision than just less bad? Trying to articulate a regenerative goal for fashion instead of a recycled, less bad goal. And there's all kinds of more stuff we can talk about there. But there is definitely an overconsumption problem in fashion. So how do I help my friends see that my not buying new clothes is a good thing and not a bad thing? Wow, that's I'm so sorry your friends are not on that page yet, but maybe this is an opportunity. Yeah, so in terms of fashion, overconsumption is obviously like a ground floor problem, like, and fast fashion is not helping at all. And the short life cycle of some of these like more poorly made products, even like there's definitely people who overconsume and they don't throw it away because it breaks, but there is also a quality problem that causes things to just not last. These polyester synthetic polymers are like often they degrade in various contexts faster than like some more resilient protein-based fibers. So, but how do you convince your friends that it's better? I think the latest number is like there's currently enough clothing to clothe the next 6 generations in production. I am a little bit cautious around too much of an individual responsibility argument because it is not, in my view, it should not fall just on the individual to make the right choice. The system needs to change so that all the choices are just better. Partly this comes from, I have a background in like food sustainability consulting. And the shorthand for me from that space is like, if you're a mom in a grocery store and you have a budget and you're looking between 2 chocolate bars and one has child slavery in it and the other doesn't, but that second one's more expensive, you shouldn't have to make that choice. There should just be no chocolate with child slavery in its supply chain. Like, that seems very vivid in that example, but somehow with petrochemicals, we're like, oh, this is like necessary evil. It's just inevitable. It's absolutely not inevitable. It's an accident of history that we've gotten to this level of dependence. So, sorry, back to the core question. How do you talk to your friends about it? I think it's up to us to figure out how to make the better choices cool again, right? So like there's a rise in thrifting. I think there's a definitely higher cultural position for reuse and rediscovering styles. There's way more style diversity that way too. It's way more exciting, I think, visually and culturally. I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts in the chat for James about how to help friends see that not buying clothes is cool? It's tough, right? Because we've built this really consumerist culture. Fast fashion is a topic I often hear about. How can more sustainable clothes be manufactured in mass quantities? Fast fashion is super inexpensive, helping its popularity. Could sustainable clothes such as yours match these prices at some point in the future? Yeah, so that some point in the future piece is back to like the technology curve of these things. Every new technology starts as more expensive because it's just not at scale. I think also an important thing to really underline is that the fashion we have right now is artificially cheap, not just because it's a co-product of fuels, but because the terrible labor regulations that exist. So being competitive will be both like biomaterials coming down in price, but also probably these fast fashion, these like synthetic pieces getting more expensive as we start to actually try to have these products take responsibility for the costs that they have. And if your clothing can last longer and be more resilient, you don't need to buy as much of it. So the consumer can have a net same long-term cost, even if any individual garment costs more. If it's not individual, how do we make these systemic changes? Yes. I am American, and half of global emissions have happened during my lifetime. I'm not super optimistic about the long-term stickiness of policy change in America. I often get pushback from Europeans where they're like, "We just need policy change. America should just get it together on policy." And there's been great things in the last couple of years. There's definitely a new paradigm, but if we've seen anything, it's that policy is not resilient. It takes so much work to pass something, and then it can be easier to undo than to create. So in terms of systemic change, that's part of why I'm interested with this project in how do core thesis here. Climate change, real, incredibly urgent, and time bound in terms of how quickly we need to be transforming our impacts. I am skeptical. I'm open to discussion. I'm skeptical about the plausibility of reinventing capitalism on the timelines that we're talking about. So how can we use capitalism to have a beneficial impact, right? How can we use this machine that's right now a one-way flow of carbon from underground to in the air? What could it look like to use that to be capturing carbon? So like, again, overconsumption is a problem, but overconsumption of bad things made bad ways from bad stuff is a problem. Like, if we could be consuming things that were beneficial, that actually the scale of clothing 8 billion people, that could be really powerful. Another thing to make clear is that demand for plastic is projected to triple by 2050. And right now we recycle, like, depending on the material, like 9% of all of our plastics. So I don't see how we recycle our way out of that. We need new non-petroleum feedstocks to meet that demand need. Okay, not individual, how to make systemic changes. Yeah, that's, again, I think, yes, we need policy, yes, vote and show up, but also go into every industry you're going into. When you get a job interview, ask the question, like, what's this company's approach to sustainability? Like, HR risk is real. Like, if a company is a bad actor on climate, they will have a harder time hiring people who care about it. So we can be pushing every industry to see that there is demand for this change, and that if they want to succeed in a capitalist frame, they need to meet that need where it is. Maybe Kohl's will close, and then there won't be super cheap new clothes. It's fascinating you include psychology in your work. Design and psychology are things I don't always think about when thinking about climate. How would you say these interests impact the way you understand and utilize science, as opposed to someone solely in the scientific field? Totally, Lauren. Design is generally super omnivorous. It's a very interdisciplinary field, and it's very much about being a facilitator between different expertise. Design is, with that said, design, I think, is particularly close to psych and sort of behavioral economics and anthropology in certain ways. In terms of the difference between my approach and someone who's in the hard sciences, I think there's often often like a gap in understanding, and even I have like a gap. I think I've gotten too in the weeds and too jargony and too nerdy about these things to really connect with everyone at this point. But I think just I'm always like sort of an advocate for people as they are, and we can't expect someone who has a whole other career and a whole other life and they're taking their kids to soccer practice to get as educated as a scientist on these topics. Like, we have to make things meaningful and salient and vivid for people where they are and with the life they have. I know we're almost out of time too. Psych. Yeah, psych. I think you have another speaker who is even more in the psych space coming up next. So if you're interested in that thread, jump into that conversation, because another piece of this project, in terms of calling it after ancient sunlight and having it be this raincoat that's translucent, is the language around climate change has become so polarized and alienating for a lot of people on both sides of the issue, right? So like, if you care about climate, but you're being told this message about like, you're the problem, you're living your life, you're the bad person, cognitive dissonance, it's like a concept. No one else is the bad guy. They always feel justified, eyes glaze over. They can rationalize it away. It's not exciting. So to come in with an offering of something that is maybe beautiful and something that you can aspire to, instead of being told you're bad, that the hypothesis there is that then I can have conversations slightly longer. Like the tuning out won't happen as fast, or like the wall of anxiety won't drop as fast. All right, thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you everyone, and thank you, Charlotte, so much for being here and taking the time to speak to us and answer all our questions. It was a fascinating presentation, and thank you so much. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thank you.
All right, now we are going to take a 1-hour break for lunch, and then we'll return at 2 o'clock. The last session of the day is Dr. Dubrow, and unfortunately he had to cancel because he was sick. So that will not be happening, but the 2 o'clock is still on, the 2 sessions of that. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for being at the session, and we hope to see you at 2. Bye.